Good morning, Christian tradition students. So I'm going to lecture a little bit this morning about the Reformation. You may see my family walking past, or you might hear them making breakfast, so just bear with me. I'm going to, I gave you a little bit of background in the first video about the Reformation and thinking about anxiety. And today I'm going to do a longer presentation that you'll be able to follow along with on the PowerPoint. Because the issues in the Reformation period surrounding Martin Luther are so essential to our understanding of the Christian tradition and to your ability to be able to think about it going forward. So a couple things. So you're reading this week, you're reading on the freedom of a Christian, and you're reading the indulgences of Martin Luther in addition to the Knoll book and watching the film on Luther. So it's all Luther this week. The couple of sort of overarching things about the readings. You're reading the document on the freedom of a Christian because it's here in this document that Luther lays out most clearly his relationship between grace and good works, grace and works. Everything about what we're going to talk about in terms of the Reformation has to do with salvation. How do we get to God? Luther often uses the term justification. And we tend to think about when you want to justify something, it's sort of like trying to prove it. I want to justify my position and prove that I'm right. I want to, that's what we usually mean. But when we're reading on the freedom of the Christian, you need to think of the term justification more in terms of like the margins on your paper, right? Justify, left justify, however you set up your paper. Justification for Luther and on the freedom of the Christian means how to make things right between human beings and God. How do we make things right between us and God so that we can be saved? How do we get justified and lined up with God? And so for the Catholic Church, as you know, there were many ways to do this. Pilgrimage, prayer, penance, all kinds of activities and behaviors that could get us right with God. And we could even buy indulgences sold by the church that would guarantee that God would take some time off of our punishment or the punishment of those that we love. There were all kinds of ways to get justified. These are called works. And in the time of the Reformation, Luther and many people who thought like him no longer felt so comfortable and trusting in those other ways of getting to God. Things had gone bad. Things were difficult in society, and that trust was no longer there. So Luther comes along and says, you know what? It's not about anything that we do. It's only about God. The only way to be justified, to be made right with God, is if God does this. And for us, we may feel today like, well, that seems, why should I have to wait on God? Can't I do something myself to make things right? But during Luther's period, that was actually a profound relief to people, to many people who heard, you know what, you don't have to go on pilgrimage. You don't have to buy indulgences. You don't have to do penance. There's nothing that you have to do. God will either choose you to be saved, he will give his grace to you, or he won't. And for Luther, that was a profound sense of relief. So that's on the freedom of a Christian. The 95 Theses that you're reading, those were documents, those were kind of complaints against the church that Luther was mounting, having to do with indulgences. Now, indulgences are a gift that the Catholic Church can give its members that, in essence, say, this punishment that you are owed, that somebody deserves, will be taken from you. And you can also buy an indulgence for another person. So let's say that somebody you loved has died and you were worried that they were in purgatory, or you knew they were in purgatory because they died with sins. You could buy an indulgence, pay money, and know that that person was having some of their punishment relieved. Now, we tend to think today that indulgences were a problem because that's like a scam of some kind. It's like a scam to make people pay to get time off of their punishment. As you read the 95 Theses, this is a really important point, especially as you get to the last few. Luther never complains that indulgences are a scam. He thinks the problem with them is that they are making God weak and beholden to human beings. They make God have to do what human beings say. And if the Catholic Church has the ability to forgive sins, Luther says, it should do so for no cost, not because of a not to hold back on that gift. So be very careful as you read the 95 Theses, not to read your own biases and prejudices into it, but read it along with your reading in the Knoll book and the historical context that you have. So that's what we're doing. And you'll see a lot of that as you watch the Luther film as well. After this lecture, I'll put this up. I'll also be putting up a Google Doc with some discussion questions that you can contribute to as the day goes on. And then we'll reconvene again on Thursday. All right, I'm going to switch the screen now so that you can see the PowerPoint as I go along with it, and you can take notes. I'll also put this PowerPoint up separately for you on Moodle when I'm done. All right, let me see if I can do this. Share screen. Just a minute. Is that sharing? Hang on, if you can still hear me. Where's my meeting? Okay, great. Here we go. All right, so I kind of gave you, oops, now why is this doing that? All right. Okay, so I gave you a little bit about this before, but the Reformation, what is it? It's the time when the Christian church divides and there become options besides Catholicism for Christians, Bible-based, other options for, and the first of this is Lutheranism. Okay, when did this happen? This happened in the 16th century. Okay, that's extremely important to know. The early 16th century is when this happened, the early 1500s, 1517, 1519. And why should we care? Well, it's one of the most important things that ever happened in Western history, this division. The assumptions behind the Reformation theology are things that we carry with us and encounter every day. And so as you're thinking about your final projects and what you're writing on in terms of the current pop cultural references or whatever to Christianity, you'll see these threads in there. So it's extremely important for our understanding of the tradition. Right. A little bit about Luther himself. Luther, and this portrait of him is very famous. He was a Catholic monk and a priest. His 95 Theses were nailed to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517. This is the first public act of the Reformation. And although he's challenged, he stands his ground, he gains followers, and these are known as Lutherans. And here in Wisconsin, we have many, many Lutherans because we have many German immigrants, Scandinavian immigrants. Some of us in the class are Lutherans. And if you are Lutheran, you probably know a lot about Martin Luther already. Okay, so in addition to Luther, we won't have too much time to spend on him. The other key reformer, magisterial reformer, we'll come back to him a little bit when we get to the American context, is John Calvin. Calvin, unlike Luther, was not a priest or a monk. He was a layman. He was French. And he builds on and refines Luther's teachings about God, and especially with regard to predestination. His followers are known as Calvinists, and the Calvinist tradition is very influential in American American religious life because the Puritans, those that came over on the Mayflower, those original Puritans, and we'll be reading about them in just a couple of weeks, they were Calvinists. Calvin didn't disagree with Luther about the importance of the Bible. He didn't disagree with him, but he built on what Luther had to say with different emphases, especially with regard to predestination. Predestination is the belief that since before the beginning of time, God has already decided who is going to be saved and who is going to be damned, and that there's nothing anyone can do about it. That seems very difficult for us to imagine and very unfair. But for Calvin, God's primary characteristic was not love, was not being loving and kind, but it was God's power. And if God left things to our hands, whether we could be saved or not, depending on actions that we take, then God is no longer all powerful. So again, as you read, try the best you can to not assume that people in the past had the same priorities about God, the same worries about salvation that you do. They were human like us. They had fears, they had anxieties, but their priorities and their needs were not always the same as ours. Calvin preferred an all-powerful God who could seem cruel to a loving God who could seem weak. All right, and that's a really important point. Let's move on a little bit to talk more carefully about what made the climate of late medieval Europe ripe for reform. I talked about this in my first video, just briefly, talking about why the Reformation now. You remember from reading about the papacy and learning about the papacy of the 9th and 10th centuries that the church was not newly corrupt in the 15th century. If the Reformation had to do with corruption, there was always corruption in the church, and serious corruption. Yet it never split until the 15th century, 16th century. So why is that? What made the climate of late medieval Europe ripe for reform? You need to be able to answer some of those questions. I'll talk about it briefly, and also in your Knoll reading, you'll learn a little bit about that. But there were theological, political, and social and economic reasons that made the reform happen in the 16th century, and the split between Catholicism and Protestantism then. So usually, if you have heard anything about the Reformation in your life, and very definitely if you've heard this from a Lutheran perspective, you learned that the Catholic Church was corrupt, in need of revitalization, and that it was selling indulgences, and there were all kinds of corruptions, and so Luther came along to clean it up. But this is far too easy. The late medieval church was not really in decline. It was not really any worse than it had been. It was an imperfect institution run by imperfect people, and that was continuing on for centuries. But what made the climate ripe for reform at the time of Luther was, as I said before, this is the one word I really want you to take away as you think about this time, is pervasive anxiety. How are we going to be saved? The old institutions, the old ways of life were no longer meeting the needs of the people. When that happens, then it's time for reform. If things are going along well, and the church is basically mostly making people feel secure about their salvation, and most people are going through their lives and feeling like, okay, I can get my sacraments at the end of my life, I can pray to the saints, I can have the monks pray for me, and I'll make it to heaven, then we don't need a reform. But when that system is no longer working, when that's breaking down, then it's time for reform. And that's exactly what was happening in the centuries leading up to Martin Luther. As I said before, you're reading the 95 Theses. These are largely complaints about the practice of indulgences, the selling of, by the church, of a way that you would lessen your punishment after death. As we think about indulgences, and I can see some of you shaking your heads right now at the very thought of the idea of indulgences, let me just put this out to you. If you were living in this time and you were offered an indulgence, you believed in hell, you believed in purgatory, someone you loved or your own self was soon to die, and you had a chance to lessen some of that punishment, you would have bought one, right? You wouldn't have been smarter than anyone else and said, well, this is just a scam. this is what people had to assuage their fears. So the problem isn't that the church was cheating the people. Although that is the problem for us. If we look back, we see this as an obvious cheat. For Luther and for his followers, the main problem wasn't necessarily that the church was cheating the people. It was that God was not being honored through this. God was being treated like a pawn of the church. And so, as you read it theologically. Don't try not to read it through the lens of your own biases about such practices. All right, let's keep going. So this image here this is a contemporary painting of the image of people who are damned, falling into hell, and the people had really lost. I'm sorry, I have to check this here. Okay. The people had really lost their faith in the church's ability to help them get to heaven, to salvation. There had been very terrible crises that we can maybe relate to here. There had been famine. Cities were getting larger. They were expanding. The areas around the cities were not always sufficient farmland to feed all the people in the cities. There was a very limited understanding of economic theory. And so when famines would come, economic downturns, people didn't understand why. They turned to God. They figured that God had to be very angry with them. The plague of the 14th century, which killed many, many people, terrified society for a long time afterwards. And plagues would pop up, and we know how scary it is to feel that there's an invisible enemy out there that we can't see, that we have to be on guard against. So people felt anxious. They thought, we must be very, very bad. We must be more sinful than we know. How can we ever do enough penance or collect enough indulgences to make things right between us and God? And those were some of the anxieties and fears leading into the Reformation. Another thing that's really important to understand is the relationship between human beings and God during this time. So we tend to think about ourselves as pretty good. We don't mostly walk around thinking that we're horrible, debased, and sinful people. We imagine that we have a lot of potential within ourselves to be good, and that what we need from God is a companion, is a friend, is somebody to be with us, to be there for us, which is a very common way of saying for people in the contemporary Christians to explain their relationship to God. God is someone that's always there for me. God is a friend to me. During the 16th century, people did not think about human beings and God in this relationship. The idea about human beings was that we are profoundly weak, debased, and sinful in ways that we might think very unhealthy now. People are weak, people are debased, people are sinful, and God is all powerful. And so God is here and we are here. We can't cooperate in our own salvation. We're too weak. There's nothing we can do to make God, think that we're deserving of mercy. And so this turns, and this is where you'll read about this and on the Freedom of a Christian, Luther kind of turns things upside down and says, well, since we're so weak and debased and sinful and can't do anything, let's just trust in God. It's all up to God. And that is the doctrine of sola fides, faith alone. Faith alone will save. Can I pause this, Martin? While I'm talking?
Try, look down, I don't know.
Just a second. Pause. My screen sharing is paused, but is the video paused?
I don't think so. Yeah, it's paused.
It's paused, it's not recording?
No.
Okay. The person is shopping for us right now. The person is just going to put the groceries in the garage. Okay, do you know how to unpause this? Okay. All right, I think this is going again. So the difference between the relationship that we assume is a normal relationship between human beings and God, one of where we are, obviously God is more powerful than we are, but the relationship is one of support and love, and that is not assumed by the reformers. God is God. We're down here. God's up here. We can't do anything, and so to even try is a terrifying prospect. If it's all up to God, we can be comforted. That's kind of the approach of the reformers, right? So we talk a lot about authority in this class, and the Reformation is all about authority. Who's got it? On what grounds? Who gets to speak for God? Where do we get our information about God? How do Catholics know what's true about God? Where do Catholics place their authority? Well, if we were in class, I could see your hands going up and we'd have answers. But you should be thinking to yourself, how do Catholics know what's true about God? Catholics get information about God from the church, from the Pope, from the tradition, from theologians, from ritual, from all kinds of practices that together are the tradition. And in addition to the tradition and the teaching of the Catholic Church, there's the Bible. So both of those are sources of authority. The tradition of the church, which includes everything going back to apostolic times, that whether it's in the Bible or not, the rituals, the Mass, the teachings of the Pope, all of that is information about God, and also the Scripture. Okay, so they're both. But for Protestants, since the time of Luther, there is only one source of authority to be trusted on God, the Bible. So the rest of it is a mess. It's human. It's contradictory. We need to simplify. We need to get back to what God wants, a simple source, and that's going to be the Bible. Now, Luther thought that would be simple, but of course, it's not simple. Hang on, sorry about this. It's not simple. The Bible has to be translated, and then which translation do we trust? Does everybody have a right to read the Bible and figure out what it means for themselves? What if those meanings are contradictory? And of course, that's what we see today. We see all kinds of people reading the Bible, different Christians emphasizing different parts of it, ignoring some parts, understanding some parts literally, understanding other parts metaphorically. Different translations give us a different sense. So while Luther was optimistic that the Bible would be a simple source of authority, it obviously it hasn't worked out that way. It's a very complex source of authority itself. And going back to some of our initial discussions at the beginning of the semester, you can see that as well. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for now. And I want you to think about issues of authority, think about the issues of God's grace versus our role in salvation and works, thinking about indulgences. Watch the Luther film. I'll be putting up some discussion questions that we can participate on that. And I'll check back in with you in the next couple days. And please reach out to me if you have questions or any concerns. The next thing that'll happen after you watch this video, you should turn to the discussion questions in the shared Google Doc that will be on Moodle, and we can kind of interact back and forth through that. All right. Put a stop. Should I put stop share? Okay, thanks.